And so today, there's blue prayer cards in front of you, and there's some in the baskets later. And we hope that you'll write down not only the things that you want us to be praying for, but also the thank yous that you might have. So that way we can thank God together. And so as we continue in our last week of our sermon series on A Farmer's Guide to the Bountiful Life, we turn our attention to the end. 30 years ago, a writer by the name of Stephen Covey wrote a book entitled The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He wrote the 7 principles that he discovered through research, and the second principle that he discovered was this: begin with the end in mind. Everybody say that? Begin with the end in mind. He put it on paper, but this is a statement that's been true for farmers since the beginning of time. Farmers always begin with the end in mind. Their goal is a harvest. And so in light of that, what they do is the dream is the harvest, and they begin by cultivating the soil with nutrients so that something good can grow out of it later in time. They go about planting the right seeds of the right crops that they want, ensuring that they're not planted too deep or too shallow. And last week we discovered that during the growing seasons, there's a pendulum swing that happens in the midst of life, right? Not good, not bad, just reality. And some of those swings are outside of our own control, whereas others are things that we have a part of. But simply, all that has been done in order for this moment in time of harvest. Harvest is the reason why farmers are farmers. They are about growing things and collecting them in order to share them. And so with that in mind, I started this week with the question of how does a farmer define success at the end of their year? And so I talked to Farmer Phil yesterday for a while. He's in Minnesota getting ready or in the process of harvesting all the corn and soybeans. And he told me that this year's been a really bad year for the Midwest. It's been really wet, and so a lot of the crop has not even yet started to get harvested, and it's already the end of October. But he smiled, I imagine, I didn't see him, but basically said that it's been a great year nevertheless. And so I asked him, as a farmer, Philip, how do you define success in your work? The very first thing he said was this: the way I define success every year is that everyone that's helping on the farm is safe. Success is that everyone that's involved in this operation goes home to their families, and we don't have any major injuries or death, because farming is quite dangerous. Not what I expected as the first thing a farmer to say, but it makes sense, because they're farming in order to produce something for others. And so wouldn't it be wise that they would care about those that are immediately in front of them, not just those that might take their crops later? And the second thing he shared about success is that for him, a yield, in other words, of what percentage of the crop does he collect, 95% or higher is considered an abundant year. 95% of the harvest is collected. So imagine this room, or any room that you would be in, and imagine that 95% of it is crop that is collectible. That would be an abundant year. But he also shared, as a farmer, you also realize that there's no guarantees. And so farmers never pray about prices, they always pray about yields. Because from year to year, everything is always changing. Based on weather and market conditions, everything that's beyond your control. And so what you hope for at the end of the year is that you have a bountiful crop. And that way, the yearly cycles, you are able to make it for the long haul. Farming is not something that comes naturally to most of us. In fact, it's this ideal of understanding an ancient world. And yet to understand our scriptures helps to understand the agrarian culture. In the ancient world, farming was the way of life, not only for your own sustenance, but also in order to trade. It was the economic reality of that time. And so today we're going to dive into a book that many of you have studied in great depth, Leviticus. How many of you have ever read or studied Leviticus? It's a fascinating book on code of law. And Leviticus is this invitation, if you look at it from a high level, of what does it mean to be a community? How do we do life together? And how do we ensure that we follow the way of God? And so this book of Leviticus is full of these helpful hints of what we ought to do. Today's passage is one specific passage that paints this picture of a farmer with a field in which, when it's time for harvest, they're called to go and leave the perimeter of the field as is, and anything that they're swinging their sickle through, it falls to leave it. Why? Because among them would be the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the alien, foreigner, non-native person. That they were supposed to leave that there so that whoever needed something could come and collect to sustain their lives and their families. It sounds pretty remarkable, doesn't it? Imagine that you had a bountiful crop of an acre, and you looked upon that crop and said, I'm going to leave a portion of it for others that haven't worked the soil, haven't come and pulled weeds, but are going to come because they have need and collect from my hard work. A contemporary rabbi by the name of Rabbi Ishmar Skorsh said it this way. This idea of harvesting, of leaving this around, is largely unenforceable. Compliance is a matter of personal choice. There is no provision for a horde of bureaucrats to sweep through your field to exercise oversight. Much of what is expected is in fact beyond measure because it is utterly subjective. The ordinance projects an ideal of mutual responsibility attained by everyone in the community. Philanthropy, he says, springs from faith. Philanthropy springs from faith. God inspires us to reach beyond ourselves. So this idea that was kind of like law was not one that was ever enforced. So no one came and checked your field to make sure you left enough. Instead, it was believed because we are God's people and God has given us everything that we have, we choose to share that which we've been given with others. And it's subjective. How much should I share? And so each field was subjectively decided by the farmer that was there. If you think this is kind of a weird law, I want to read some other passages that share this premise along with this. You'll hear some repetitive stuff. Later in Leviticus chapter 23, it says it this way. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 to 21 says it this way. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all of your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, do not strip what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. Guess who it's for? The alien, the orphan, and the widow. Do you hear this recurring phrase? Now, if I'm honest, this isn't very good American policy. Open borders is what they're suggesting. They're saying that when these aliens are here among you, when the widows who have no way of taking care of themselves, when the orphans that are by themselves or are going hungry, your job as a community is to care for them and to ensure that there's something for them to have for themselves. This is what it means to be faithful to the way of God. It doesn't always make you popular in the country in which you live, but it's this kingdom that we're a part of that doesn't have boundaries. Instead, what we have are brothers and sisters. And then we're invited to be hospitable to those that come into our midst. The story of Ruth is one of a woman who is an alien, who marries an Israeli guy who's moved to her neck of the woods. And her husband dies, and her mother-in-law releases her to go back to her people. And Ruth's famous phrase is, your people are now my people. Where you go, I will go. And so she goes back to this land, and they all of a sudden find themselves as two widows with no one to help them. And Ruth goes to a field to glean, to gather grain to make food for her and her mother-in-law. The interesting thing about the story of Ruth is that if you turn to Matthew chapter 1, in Matthew chapter 1, there's a lineage of Jesus' past, of those who have come before him. Do you know whose name is in the lineage of Jesus? Ruth, the non-Israelites. And what ends up happening is that Ruth is adopted into the community and is married into it yet again. If you go further into our scriptures in Hebrews and our New Testament, it says it this way: do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, you have entertained angels without knowing it. What if we saw strangers as angels unaware, instead of enemies to be scared of? These scriptures continually invite us to imagine a different way of seeing our world and seeing it with a lens of God. And so throughout this Old Testament and into the New Testament, you see it lived out among the people, that they share out of their resources to bless each other and the community at large. They realize that everything that they've been given is a gift from God's very hand, including their very life. And they are to use it to go out and to share love and grace and the goodness of God wherever they are called to go. And so when I was talking to Farmer Phil, as we were talking, I was listening intently to what he does at harvest time, not only in terms of job, but his orientation to it. And the two things that struck me most is, first, he said, I give thanks every year. I start with giving thank you to God for what I have. It may be a great year, it may not be a great year, but I give thanks. Imagine if we always started our day with thank you. Or Pastor Brandon was one day telling me that he used to work with someone that always started every conversation when someone was upset with thank you. What if we oriented ourselves around an attitude of gratitude that allowed us to see the good that's in our world and in each other? And so it starts with this harvest of thank you. And secondly, what he shared with me is that he believes that he's been blessed with so much, he is called to share it with others. We call that stewardship in the church. We call it being generous of spirit. We call it being Christian. That we're given so much in this life. We've been forgiven. We've been shown mercy. We've been given love that will never fail us. And so we, in response, give it as well. That which is in our pockets is on loan to us from on high, to be used in such a way that it brings goodness to bear on our earth. And so we invite you every year to come and light the spire up to ensure that we can continue the mission of God. Did you know that the Old Testament teaching was that all of us are invited to give minimally 10% of that which we have in order to bless the world around us? That wasn't the high goal of 10%, that was the starting point. And then they went above that. But the average American, based on the latest studies, is the average American gives about 2% of their resource away in any given year. Henry Nouwen, one of the great spiritual leaders, said it this way. He's an American guy who was born and raised somewhere else, came here and saw the immensity of wealth that our country has. As some say, we might be the most wealthy country to ever exist in the world. And this is what he wrote. Our nation is affluent and has more than it needs. The realization that what we have is a free gift can deepen our desire to share this gift with others who cry out for help. When we bless the fruits of the harvest, let us at least realize that blessed fruits need to be shared. Otherwise, the blessing turns into a curse. Otherwise, our blessings turn into a curse. We are a community that I believe are called to share. And later in the service, we're going to do good news, part two. Because last week was part one. Part two is a language, not English. The reality is that there's so much good not happening only here among us and in you, but in our world. Because God is always at work among us. It's just whether or not we're choosing to see it and choosing to be a part of it. And so today, as we contemplate what is the harvest of our lives, what is it that God has given to you to be a caretaker of, to share broadly and generously with those around you? For all of us are a part of this blessing network. None of us are immune from it, but instead, all of us are invited to partake in it. And when we do, I have this deep belief that there's never a need among us, but instead, everyone has everything they need for a full and bountiful life. So may it be so among us today. Amen.